once upon a time, there was a tribe, There was the chieftain, but then there was the shaman. And the tribe couldn't survive without the shaman, even though the chieftain maybe had the power, you know what I mean, and had the spears, but the shaman kept the tribe together. And we as doctors need to assume a leadership role as the shamans of our culture.
3, 2, 1, liftoff.
Welcome to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. This is where we talk about how to start up a ketamine infusion clinic, market it, and more. In this episode, Sam interviews Dr. Howard Kornfeld, a nationally recognized pioneer in pain and addiction medicine, triple board certified physician, and founder of Recovery Without Walls. Dr. Kornfeld shares his remarkable 5-decade journey through medicine, from his transformative experiences at the Esalen Institute to his pioneering work with buprenorphine that preceded mainstream adoption by over a decade. We covered the evolution of pain medicine from the 1920s to today, Dr. Kornfeld's unique path from emergency medicine through nuclear activism to integrative holistic practice, and the context behind the renewed interest in psychedelic medicine. We learned a lot in this interview and hope you do too. Now let's jump into the episode.
We are very excited to have Dr. Howard Kornfeld join us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sam.
So let's get started at the beginning. Can you take us back to the early days of your career, maybe pre-med or med school? Kind of tell us the little bit of background and what drew you into emergency medicine initially.
Sure. Well, when I entered medical school in 1971, I had been through some of the last years of the late 60s, so to speak, and the first year of the 70s. And so I was exposed to a lot of the social upheaval at the time. And of course, this was the time when psychedelic drugs, so to speak, had started to become used in a wider way among college-age students more than any other segment of the population. And so I experienced some of those trends and not so much the addiction trends that I became aware of later, things like cocaine or opiates. So I was aware that the substances that were popular, I went to Northwestern, which was a bit of a conservative campus compared to, let's say, UC Berkeley or, some of the East Coast places and or even the University of Chicago. But yet the 60s did come to Northwestern. And so when I went into medical school, I had this belief system that the world was changing, but that medicine was sort of old school. Like what I was going to be learning was like the old stuff, and I wanted to know the new stuff, but I also wanted to become a doctor and know the foundation. So I had 2 tracks in mind when I was in medical school: learn what they had to teach, but always question it, and look for contradictions, in what was being taught. So that was how I approached medical school.
Yeah, it's a great way because even when I went to med school, they said something like 50% of what we teach you is going to be incorrect, and we don't know what that 50% is. So it's up to you, Sam, to be a lifelong learner. So that was kind of the philosophy that we had at our med school. But for you, it sounded like it was maybe not like that philosophy or perspective.
Yeah, well, for example, here's a small example. I think during the second year of medical school, we were mainly getting basic science lectures, but there was some clinical lectures. And there was a surgeon who was teaching about the current approach to breast cancer. And he was explaining the diagnostic process and the therapeutic process, which mainly at that time involved what are called radical mastectomies,
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I had done some reading on radical mastectomies independent of this class, and I had read that not only in Europe were they not being done anymore, but there was a leading American center at the Cleveland Clinic that was doing less radical surgeries, where either doing simple mastectomies or even lumpectomies, for the same kind of cancers. So I raised my hand after, towards the end of the lecture, and I made this comment, and the surgeon became very angry, and he said, I don't know, who, he says, that guy from the Cleveland Clinic, he should be thrown in jail, You know what I mean? It was that, extreme, So then I knew there was something very deep, about medical orthodoxy versus newer ideas. And I remember I was still an emergency room doctor, a good, I would say, 10, 12, 14 years later, doing a night shift, doing a little reading, and the New England Journal of Medicine major article, radical mastectomies were no better, than simple lumpectomies, you know, lead study in the New England Journal, major double-blind study. So that in a way, I felt, wow, um, trust your instincts when things don't seem the way they should be, and question things when they should be.
Yeah. And we can tell that surgeon, he may or may not be alive at this point, but you can say, told you so.
Right, right, right.
You have a really unique medical journey, Dr. Kornfeld, because you're triple board certified at one point.
That's right.
And tell us how did that evolve, and what drove those transitions? Because I mean, I have one board certification in emergency medicine, but triple board certified, that's quite a lot of work. So tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, given how I was feeling, in med school, I I drifted into the third year, and I was at these very prestigious hospitals, Northwestern University, and I noticed that the clinical role of the third year medical student was quite limited in those hospitals, in that it had a military feel to it, like you were the buck private, and then there were ranks, and you were supposed to just stand there at attention, and that sort of thing. But one of my rotations was at Cook County Hospital, the county hospital, and even though it was very chaotic, I felt like a part of things. I said, "Wow, they needed me." They needed the medical students to actually do stuff. Draw some blood here. See one, do one, teach one. So I felt, you know, I could do all my clerkships in these prestigious things, and then try to get that letter, so I could, like, career, advance in the usual way. But I said, I just want to learn medicine, and it'll all play out in the long run. So I took all my electives at Cook County Hospital for my senior year, as we were trying to figure this out. And then I noticed that I was really happy in the emergency room, or sort of in the trauma center too, where things were just coming and going. You didn't have a list of patients who were chronically ill with 8 different medicines, but you were doing stuff, and I questioned a lot of the medicine in general. But when I was in the emergency room, sewing up things or intubating someone who wasn't breathing, I said, this is clear-cut medicine. I really want to learn this stuff. And the field of emergency medicine was just emerging at that time. There were only a few residencies around. It hadn't been really recognized by the American Board of Medical Specialties. So a few months into my senior year, I heard that there was a hospital in our area, a Catholic teaching hospital. It wasn't quite as prestigious as maybe the Northwestern, but I heard that you could get in there outside of the match, and I could get in there early because I was gonna graduate early. So I said, "What the hell?" And I heard that I could do a lot of emergency medicine there, and it was kind of a trauma center too. So I signed up for there. So I wasn't worried about, like, competing in the match, and so that was another thing because I had never competed to get into med school because I got into med school out of high school. The Northwestern was called the honors program or the 6-year program. So somehow the universe helped me not have to compete so much and just do what I was doing and then get to the next step, you know? So so I did my internship, after doing all these rotations at Cook County Hospital, which I think was the hospital that they made quite a few TV shows about, because it was a classic busy county hospital. And, and indeed, at this Catholic hospital, they allowed me to 2 extra rotations in the emergency room. So I did almost like 2 or 3 months of emergency medicine there. And then I did trauma service and things like that. Um, so when it ended, there were like multiple jobs for emergency physicians, just coming out of internship without the residency, because basically the whole health system had shifted, and so much medicine was now presenting, in more urgent ways. And in the old days, they just had the OB doctors or the orthopedic doctors like cover the ER, but then they realized that they didn't really know what they were doing if it wasn't in their specialty. So I dove into emergency medicine at a rural hospital not too far from Chicago, but a place where there were 2-lane highways, multiple, a lot of drinking, like vacationing area, and also nobody was wearing seat belts yet. It was just the time when seat belts were coming in, and then who was the advocate there? Ralph Nader, I don't know if you remember his name. He was an advocate, national advocate for seat belts. So I kinda got a sense, well, hey, this public health guy, was kind of important, and I did my, a year or 2 there, and then I was called to California for various reasons, I I had decided to do some, psychotherapy with a Jungian psychotherapist, and she had her foot in the door at a place called Esalen Institute, in Big Sur,
Mhm.
which is a human potential growth center that's been there now for, since around the early 1960s. So I ended up going over there, and one of the reasons, June Singer, who was my therapist, one of the reasons that she thought I should go there is that I was pondering what were the meaning of these psychedelic type experiences that I had when I was in college, because I really hadn't explored it much. Nose to the grindstone in med school and, just do the stuff, and so she thought, well, there's a guy there named Stanislav Grof. I don't know if that name is familiar to you, but he was a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist that had come over to the United States somewhere in the early 70s, I believe, or excuse me, maybe even a little earlier. And it was the era when research with LSD, for example, was still ongoing. It hadn't been shut down. And he got involved with a place in Maryland, quite uh, an intensive program there. But I think things had gotten shut down by the time I made it to Esalen, which was 1977. And he had been invited to be a teacher over there at Esalen, and he held these workshops, which he brought in multiple people who were not always involved with psychedelics per se, but were involved with consciousness, explorations in one fashion or another. And even people like Fridtjof Capra, who was a physicist who was trying to connect the East and the West in terms of physics. And there was this fellow, Ralph Metzner, um, who was a psychologist in California, but had been part of you know, the Three Musketeers at Harvard, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner. So I met a lot of interesting people, and it was like a kaleidoscope of experience for a guy from Chicago, and I actually felt some healing happening, and in fact, stuff I had just touched on with that therapist, I was able to go deeper and feel a sense of healing. So at the end of that workshop, I was invited to stay at Esalen a bit longer and take some other courses, and one of them was on like a broad spectrum of holistic health, what was known at that time, what was being explored, acupuncture, herbs, body work, Rolfing, So, I feel very fortunate to have sort of landed there, when I was still single, I was somewhat footloose and fancy-free, and I could explore all this stuff, and that's what, I did, but I left there thinking that, um, this is fascinating. I think, I might just go into psychiatry, Yeah. So I practiced emergency medicine a bit longer. I was accepted in a psychiatry residency at University of Michigan, and it was April, and the psychiatry residency was starting in July. And again, I felt that this would be a way to maybe explore further this realm of what's the meaning of the psychedelic drugs versus conventional approaches. And then something interesting happened. I was driving to like a 48-hour ER shift. That's what we used to do in those days. We
Wow.
used to drive to an outlying town, and they really needed help there. And we could just do that. And then, we'd have the rest of the week off. I don't think they allow that anymore, even, but maybe in the smallest hospitals, they still do that. But this was a pretty busy hospital. But I was young, and that's what we did in those days. And on the way to the hospital, I hear on the news that the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant is having a meltdown, And I didn't really know much about nuclear power. I hadn't really looked into it, or frankly, nuclear weapons or that whole nuclear technology. I knew that a physics teacher of mine from college was questioning something about nuclear energy being maybe in the end not very efficient or cost effective for society because of the nuclear waste and other aspects of it. But so I arrived at my ER shift and I dove into work there. But when you're doing an ER shift, you could be very busy for 3 hours, and then all of a sudden it's quiet, and you go to your room, you conk out, you try to get a little rest, before the next call, and you hook you turn the TV on and you see what's happening. And then by the first day, they were saying, who came on? Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, the same guy who I saw saved so many lives in the emergency room, because we would see you had seat belts, you might have some bruises on your body, maybe the clavicle's fractured, but your head's fine, but no seat belts, you're a mess, your neck is broken, airway is compromised, it's so anyway, this guy comes on and he says, I am recommending that the governor evacuate 50 miles from this nuclear power plant, And then I said, wow, that's pretty interesting. Then the governor comes on and he says, I have been advised to only evacuate 5 miles, only pregnant women and children. I said, wow, that's a big difference. So there's something kind of fishy going on here. Yeah,
Yeah, disconnect there.
yeah. So that whole drama was playing out while I was at the end of my shift there. And then I had some friends in the area. Rather than drive home, I decided to stay with my friends. They were old friends from college, kind of late 60s people who I shared certain kind of attitudes with. And as soon as I arrived, even though I was somewhat sleep deprived, they said, hey, let's go to this movie, The China Syndrome, which was this movie came out right at the same time, as the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. And the China Syndrome was about a nuclear power plant that was having a meltdown. And it was with Jane Fonda. There was that thing. So we saw the movie. And, by the time that movie was over, I said, physicians should do something about this problem. So I called some friends of mine, and they said, yeah, there is a group of physicians meeting, and I'll give you their name. And so I called them, and I went to the second meeting of what's called the San Francisco chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And they were working on the nuclear power mainly and the dangers of the nuclear power plants. So I quickly dove in and studied about radiation and the issues around that. And then all of a sudden, because we were physicians, other groups were asking us, could you come and speak at our meeting about radiation? Of course, we were just somewhat new to it, but we were doctors. We could understand the techno. So we started to get invited, to be speakers. And there were a few very charismatic individuals at that time. One of them was named Daniel Ellsberg, who had become famous again in the earlier 70s because of the Pentagon Papers as sort of a whistleblower. But he was really a nuclear weapon strategist who had then now become a someone who was going to warn us about the dangers of nuclear war and how we have this system in place that could go wrong, fairly easily. And there was another physician named Helen Caldecott, who was an Australian doctor who was a sort of a firebrand and very moving speaker. And she had taken it upon herself to be a leader in this area. She was at Harvard at the time. She was like a pediatric oncologist or something like that, who was sensitive to radiation issues. So I was doubly inspired, and by this time, things were shifting from nuclear power to nuclear weapons, because right around that time, it was 1979, 1980. The nuclear arms race was building up. The Cold War was still in effect. It hadn't thawed yet. And then when Ronald Reagan was elected, and if in a minute I'll say what the good stuff Reagan did in this regard, but right at that moment, he had surrounded himself with some nuclear weapon strategists who were advocating that the U.S. just declare they were ready to fight nuclear war with the Soviet Union because they felt we had more firepower, and that we could take the blow, we could attack them and take the blow, and the world will be a better place. There were actually people pretty high up doing this, and they were publishing. So it was then that some high-level medical leaders, both at Harvard Medical School and at UCSF, just decided we're going to get involved with this. And then this international group formed, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And it was started by a famous cardiologist, Bernard Lown, at Harvard, along with the cardiologist who was the doctor to the leader of the Soviet Union, who was at that time named Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev. And these two cardiologists had become friends at international meetings, and they said, let's start this group. And Brezhnev actually wanted this to happen because I think they were recognizing the danger and they didn't want to compete with the United States on that level. And so they, in a way, had permission. We didn't need permission in the United States at that time. Hopefully we don't in the future, that we have a democracy and freedom of speech. So we exercised our freedom, and we got active and had a Congress that we called it the first Congress of IPPNW, International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. And it was held in the Washington, D.C. area in 1981, and it led to a Nobel Peace Prize for the group by 1985. And based on that and based on conferences that we held, with the help of these medical leaders from Harvard and UCSF and elsewhere, we had credibility, and we would hold a conference, and then the newspapers would write a story, and people started to get really concerned about the risk of nuclear war. And there were movements in the United States. One of them was called the Freeze movement, just trying to freeze the escalation of nuclear armaments. And indeed, again, history was sort of kind to the world. Things were happening in the Soviet Union. There was a restructuring. Gorbachev came in. He created something called perestroika, kind of a new opening. And indeed, there was starting to be a dialogue, not only at the highest level, but at the citizen level. And where did some of this dialogue happen? At Esalen Institute, actually this place where I had gone to understand psychedelics, was also involved at they called it Track 2 diplomacy, and they hosted people in Gorbachev's circle in the hot tubs at Esalen, if you could believe it. And they actually got a tour. They sponsored a tour of Boris Yeltsin, who had eventually became the head of the Soviet Union, but at that time was the mayor of Moscow. So there was this interesting confluence of events going on then that somehow I found myself in the middle of. And then what happened with Esalen is the founder, the co-founder of Esalen, Richard Price, heard that I was working on this dimension, but I had also been at Esalen a couple years earlier and had gotten to know him. So he basically said to me, look, I know you're out there working hard, trying to save the world, giving talks. I said, why don't you come down here at Esalen anytime you want, just relax, sit in the hot tubs, get a massage, renew your spirit and your strength, because I know you're doing good stuff. So I took him up on his offer, and I started to visit Esalen. And when I was visiting there, of course, it's an isolated place way down on the Big Sur coast. So anytime anyone sprains their ankle, oh, there's a doctor around there, So I started to be like the camp doctor, there for anything that was happening. And again, my mind was starting to open up because, of course, people at Esalen didn't want the usual stuff. If they had a sore throat, say, well, they could prescribe, some penicillin. Oh, no, I don't want that. I want comfrey herbs, So I said, well, okay, we'll keep track of it. So my mind was open, to non-traditional ways of medicine. And in fact, there was like a psychedelic culture. Esalen didn't officially condone the use of any illegal drug on their property, of course, but it was known that people explored those kind of things discreetly and in a way that wouldn't cause any problems. So I became friends with one of the older people at Esalen. His name was Paul Herbert, and Paul was the chronicler of events at Esalen. He was like he made audio tapes in those days, those little cassettes, those little cassette tapes. So he made these cassette tapes of many very well-known, famous, presenters, um, there. And I got to know him, and he one day he was telling me about Sasha Shulgin. He knew Alexander Shulgin, who was credited with inventing not only MDMA, although it was probably reinventing, but many other phenethylamines, which are, the drugs that are sort of based on the mescaline, molecule. And one day he offered me a dose of MDMA and said he would sit with me. So I took it, and I found a lot of wisdom, and gratitude inside during that experience. And I said, I would like to meet this Dr. Shulgin, this Alexander Shulgin. So I was involved with both preventing nuclear war, and then I was sort of reintegrated into this psychedelic, cutting edge at Esalen. And so I wrote Sasha or Alexander Shulgin a letter. I said, I'm working on these things. And he wrote me back, and he said, well, I don't know if you doctors could really save the world, but why don't you come over and visit, So I visited him, and I got to know him and his wife, Anne Shulgin, who they ended up writing the two books, P-Col and T-Col, phenethylamines and tryptamines, etc. And it was a love story of their relationship, but then in the back of the book was like a chemical cookbook of how to make these 100 or so variations of the molecules, that could be tools for human exploration. So anyway, I know I've been giving you a long narrative, but this was sort of how things got started for me in California.
Did you end up going to the psychiatry residency because you said you were, at University of Michigan, or did that get put on the back burner? Because
yeah, I did call the director, and I said, I'm really sorry, but I have to save the world first. Then I'll save a place for me a few years down, and and of course he probably tried to psychoanalyze me a little bit, but I ended up just staying staying in emergency medicine to make a living, devoting my other time to the cause of preventing nuclear war. But eventually, as I hung out at Esalen, and a lot of progress was made then in this area of preventing nuclear war. The number of nuclear weapons when this process started was 60,000 in the world, and it shrank to 12,000, where it still rests today, even though the doomsday clock is closer than ever to midnight, to global apocalypse, even because it only takes a few dozen nuclear weapons, you could devastate the planet,
Absolutely.
So although tremendous progress was made, at a fundamental area, the deeper logic was never changed, in this nuclear arms race. But after working at it for 3, 4 years, I probably unconsciously assumed that maybe progress was being made. I could shift my focus. And so in a way, I did shift them on some level to drugs, to not only the beneficial things of psychedelics, but after a while, in seeing what was happening with psychedelics, and they were just starting to, the FDA was just starting to open up again to allowing official research, with psychedelic compounds. I realized that, maybe I need to learn more about drugs in general. And what was actually available were fellowships in, they called it substance abuse. We now call it addiction medicine. And so I dove into a fellowship in addiction medicine at UCSF in the VA. And that led me to my second board certification. And I had become board certified in emergency medicine, even without a residency, because of the years of work and continuing ed and taking the exams. They allowed that in those days. And so I was now in my second specialty of addiction medicine. And again, we weren't really dealing with psychedelics per se, but I was learning a lot about neurochemistry and psychopharmacology in general. And then keeping my foot in the door at Esalen, with what was going on there. And at one point at Esalen, a philanthropist said, "I'll give you $4,000 if you organize a conference, at Esalen on the cutting edge things going on." So I knew that wasn't enough money, so I went to the Esalen establishment, who I was friendly with, and although they were very careful in those days of not wanting to appear to the world as, a leading edge in psychedelics, because they still are, concerned about how they would appear to the world. They said, "Okay, we'll give you 14 places for room and board here, and this wonderful conference setting, this house." And so we used the $4,000 to fly people in, quite, eminent individuals, some from the East Coast, who were previously in positions of authority, like at the National Institute of Mental Health, and also even the so-called drug czar's office in the White House, and some of them were Republicans, but, we were all interested in restarting psychedelic research, that had really been put on hold for a 20-year period. And we brought Charlie Grobe from UCLA, who was starting to do some work with MDMA, and Rick Strassman, who had already gotten permission to do some DMT research at the University of New Mexico. He was there. And in fact, one of the early ibogaine people, her name was Deborah Mash, from University of Miami, and she was already looking to set up a center on St. Kitts. It's a separate country, island in the Caribbean, because there was such resistance at the level of the NIH or NIDA, to research ibogaine because of the cardiac risks, that had been even then identified. So, some of the real pioneers were there, and I got to, be part of that discussion. And the Shulgins came, and we had, and there's a fellow who came named Robert Jesse. I don't know if that's familiar to you, Bob Jesse.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, and Bob was a very young, for his position, vice president, one of the multiple vice presidents of the Oracle Corporation. And he was an electrical engineer, and he had already broken the glass ceiling for a gay man, you know. He had already broken the glass ceiling at a place called Bell Labs, you know, and now he was at Oracle. And he got wind of the early rave movement with MDMA in San Francisco, and he saw in it not only just sort of an electronic dance, you know, scene, but he saw in it a spiritual core, you know, that people were tapping into a spiritual core for humanity, and he wanted to explore that. And so he started the Council on Spiritual Practices, he called it. And then, as he is now, he's just a very insightful individual. He's working with Michael Pollan, you know, at the Berkeley um, Center for the Science of Psychedelics, you know, as is another friend of mine who was at Esalen, David Presti, who is a professor of molecular neurobiology, who's really an explorer of mind body and explorer of meditation, and a teacher for the Dalai Lama's scientists. You know, interesting guy. So it turns out there was another important individual there at Esalen, of course, Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin was there, you know, who was really at a little bit of an earlier stage, you could imagine, at developing MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And then Rick was already trying to bolster his own academic credentials in order to move psychedelics forward. So he was a student at the Harvard Kennedy School for Public Policy. Where else, you know, right at the center of things, you know? And who was his teacher? Mark Kleiman. And Mark was at our place. Now, Mark was a really brilliant, tough character who was a moderate Democrat in terms of political affiliation, but was much more law enforcement oriented, you know, in terms of drugs. Like he didn't want the war on drugs to end or anything, you know, I mean, he wanted it to be more humane, more effective, you know, but so he was friends with the law enforcement establishment, let's say, okay, but Rick Doblin had opened up his mind to psychedelics, that the need for psychedelic research, so he came. So Mark, who was this savvy government insider, you know, in a way, and Harvard professor, paired up with Bob Jesse, you know, who came, you know, through not only another establishment scene at Oracle, but had discovered the spiritual power of the rave scene, the early rave scene, you know, which actually, you know, MDMA, although MDMA and mescaline are very different, you know, in a way, it is a derivative of mescaline, you know, and if you read the wonderful comprehensive global history of mescaline, you know, that was written a few years ago, published by, you know, one of the university presses. Do you remember the Carlos Castaneda book?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I do. Yeah.
So in the Carlos Castaneda books, the American public, particularly the youth, you know, that were trying to open their minds, really were introduced to this Native American psychedelic spirituality, you know, and there's some connection that was drawn between that and then when the MDMA rave scene came about. And so there's a reason that the beats and the music, it had a Native American quality to it, you know? So, so here we have Bob Jesse, Mark Kleiman. There'd been minimal psychedelic research allowed for 20 years, just the earliest stirrings of it. Nobody wanted to fund this stuff. You know, no foundation would fund it. It was too risky. Government wouldn't fund it. So, you know, they were, in addition to trying to get permission, you know, they were just trying to scrape by some kind of more visionary philanthropists, you know, who would fund this stuff. But they put their heads together, and Bob had the vision of, let's do a study that doesn't necessarily immediately look at, can a psychedelic cure an illness, but could a psychedelic enrich, you know, the humanity of a well person who has already spiritually connected, you know? And then early on they identified psilocybin is the better tool to use. LSD had so much baggage, you know. The psilocybin experience is not quite as long, so a little bit easier to do the research. And they identified psilocybin, and then they decided to look to Hopkins, Johns Hopkins, for expertise. And there were some friendly leaders in their neuroscience department. And then there was Bill Richards, who was still around, who had done the research at that Maryland Institute that Stan Groff was in. So they put together, and then they discovered Roland Griffith, who was an experimental psychopharmacologist who had incredible credentials and who recently had become interested in Buddhism and meditation. And this team all of a sudden came together and they worked very quietly, you know, a little bit, you know, like Rick Doblin has one strategy. They had another strategy, work really quietly. And they got to the authorities and the DEA and they said, look, we want to do this. We're going to be very responsible. And they basically got green lights, you know, and they started their research and they very carefully did it. And they did that study, which was eventually published maybe in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, first decade, that talked about, you know, the positive effect, you know, of giving psilocybin to this group of not ill people, but people who were grounded in some sort of religious tradition already, but whose life could be enriched and enhanced. And so our little conference, although it came and went, you know, I feel really good that it helped, you know, the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, listeners, this is Kim, and I just want to acknowledge that you're here for a reason. Maybe you're stuck in a cycle of long shifts, feeling a little burnt out, and wondering if there's any other way to practice medicine, especially on your own terms. We've been there, and that's exactly why we created this free checklist, your step-by-step roadmap to starting a ketamine clinic without those costly mistakes. Grab your copy now at www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. It's completely free because we want you to succeed, not struggle. And hey, if you're driving or mid-workout, don't sweat it. Just check out the show notes for the link when you're ready. And again, that's www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. Now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, it sounds almost like the Esalen Institute was, in a way, a educational. It was like a residency or a school for you.
That's right.
As far as, I mean, it sounds like it impacted your career tremendously because of, you know, the relationship, the courses you took, opening your mind to different complementary and alternative medicines, the importance of preventing nuclear war, and then just all those connections. And I didn't realize how powerful and influential the Esalen Institute was in playing a role in all of these factors. So yeah, that's amazing. And it sounds like you met and interacted and was a part of this really influential group in the psychedelic community, whether that's Bob Jesse or Rick Doblin, Rick Strassman. Like, it's just so many people. So you've been in this for a long time
I have.
and you've connected, you've made a lot of friends. Just to follow up on the question about, though, then you got a third board certification. So
Right.
this is kind of, I guess, like part 3 in a way. How did that come to be, the
Yeah.
pain
Right.
medicine board certification
Right.
and training?
I'll dive right into that, but just to end these first 2 phases, the psychedelics and the preventing nuclear war. Uh, so I became convinced after these experiences that, to paraphrase something that Margaret Mead once said, that a small number of people working together can actually make significant change, you know? And if you're at the right time and the right place and you lever the right kind of insights, you know. So um, I I dove into addiction medicine, you know, because I had just certified in it, and I was still practicing emergency medicine, but it got to where I met a leader in addiction medicine. His name was Alex Stallcup. He was quite a wonderful mentor to me, and he had already been through his own political activism. He was one of those doctors during the Vietnam War that brought napalm-burned children, you know, over from Vietnam to be treated here, and of course, not only help them, but open up the eyes of the American people to let's end this Vietnam War, you know, before we do more harm. So, so he was an activist, and he was a guy who was a pediatric pulmonologist originally, but he had been hanging around San Francisco, and there was a group called Rock Med, which was doctors who went to, like, Grateful Dead concerts and others, you know, who took care of people who were tripping and, you know, who had bad trips and everything. So he was a cool guy, and he decided, well, I'm gonna just do addiction medicine, even though I'm in this other specialty. And he brought a very keen mind to the field, and he was a leader in benzodiazepine dependency, and I became knowledgeable, but we were getting a lot of opiate, you know, cases. This was even before OxyContin, you know, right before OxyContin came in. It was starting to build up with other things like Vicodin, Percocets, you know, and then all of a sudden OxyContin started to come in, and we thought on one level, well, this might be a good thing because there's so many people in pain, and OxyContin was going to be a long-acting, you know, it was going to be, this could help get people off of Vicodin, you know, I mean, there was all kind of misconceptions and ideas around. But then also, he heard about this drug called buprenorphine, which is commonly referred to as Suboxone, you know, which is one of the brand names. So we started to treat both addiction and pain at the same time, because a lot of the pain cases that were spinning out of control with Vicodin and with they had long-acting morphine around then, MS-Contin, you know, and this is when the Duragesic patches, the fentanyl patches were coming in, and even fentanyl lollipops, everybody was using them, it was a wild, wild west, and there was more and more opiate addiction. And yet we heard that there was this incredible drug named buprenorphine, but it wasn't really available yet. It was, and yet we heard that in France they were using it for addiction and were making tremendous progress, and then so we didn't quite understand what was going on, and then we discovered that the buprenorphine was actually FDA approved in the U.S., but as a shot for acute pain, and it had been approved for the last 15 years, since 1981, but it was very rarely used. And so we put two and two together with the help of some other doctors, and we said, we could use this in a compounded way that people could put into their mouth, because it wasn't a drug that was well absorbed in the stomach. You had to absorb it mucosally in the oral cavity, or it can be injected too. Um, so we started to use this for our pain cases, and it really helped stabilize them. But we were warned, you can't use it for addiction only, because of these old laws that go back 100 years, that came around with the heroin emergence 100 years ago. There were prohibition laws set in that made it illegal for doctors to actually treat addiction, with an opiate. And those laws to some degree still exist, so if now we have buprenorphine and we have methadone, so we don't have to worry about it. But the only way to treat opiate dependency before methadone and buprenorphine was to give someone a different opiate so they didn't go into full-blown withdrawal, But but anyone with an opiate addiction was considered almost a criminal, And so I started to put two and two together. Well, maybe this is why our system is so skewed against psychedelics, because there's some deep, really very deep stigmas and criminalizations of anyone with any kind of drug issue. And I started to think, why is our society so awkward and not sophisticated, about these things? And it started to dawn on me that, well, maybe because we separate mind and body, you know what I mean? Because we're rooted in that old system, of mechanistic reductionist thinking, and so I started to read this biological theorist and anthropologist named Gregory Bateson, who was married to Margaret Mead at one point, and a wonderful book came out not so long ago called Tripping on Utopia, by Benjamin Breen, that highlighted Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson's involvement with psychedelics way back to around World War II, and how, LSD was first brought to the United States actually in around 1949, to be used in certain hospitals, and of course then the military took charge of a whole wing of that research, because we were afraid that the Soviet Union was getting an edge on us. They had developed their own atomic bomb, and it was, we needed to use these psychedelics as tools of mind control, or tools for espionage, or psychological warfare. So that's another reason that psychedelics got such a bad start, because so much of it was for control and for, in a way, punishing rather than for healing, But back to buprenorphine, here we had a tool that could really help. We had methadone already for opiate addiction in the 1990s, but buprenorphine we didn't have yet. And the methadone was very peculiar. You had to go to it was like a little bit of a branch of the criminal justice system, you know what I mean? You had to go to a clinic that had like almost barbed wire around it, you know what I mean? And you had to show up and you got your dose and you know what I mean? And it was very regimented, and this was how we were treating, one of the major problems of the 20th century, which is the heroin addiction epidemic, which was starting to fill up our jails with people who had never been there before. Our whole criminal system was expanding. So we figured out a way to use buprenorphine legally as long as we were a little bit careful. If we treated addiction patients, they also had a pain condition. And the reality is that after a certain age, everyone has some kind of pain. So, we felt we were doing the right thing and following our ethical, oath, so to speak, as doctors. And yeah, so we started to treat pain and addiction at the same time. And then I learned that the whole pain specialization was just gelling, and that you could, after doing this for 10 years, they were still allowing, if you had 10 years of experience, in pain medicine and could document continuing education, you could take the pain boards that were, again, ABMS certified, the highest certification. So that's how I got my third board. And so we were early adopters of the buprenorphine. Uh, the FDA didn't approve it for another 7 or 8 years. By that time, we were already experienced in using it. And then nobody really started using it for another 5 or 8 years. So we were 10, 15 years ahead of everyone else using buprenorphine. And, so I was busy, and it was easy to kind of put some of the global problems aside for a moment, and concentrate on this. So that's what I was doing at that time.
Wow. You have had an incredible career and history. I feel like I'm getting a like psychedelics history 101 just talking with you, Dr. Kornfeld. So thank you for all of the background. You have a really unique perspective because of your background with emergency medicine, psychedelics, substance use, addiction, pain medicine. So what are some of the biggest, let's say, misunderstandings or misconceptions that, traditional doctors have about treating chronic pain from your perspective?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's been these pendulum swings for treatment of pain. So back 100 years ago, before it was called the Harrison Tax Act or Narcotic Act, around 1919, um, opiates were sold without a prescription, in every state in the United States by pharmacies. So anyone could, just like you could buy cigarettes and get yourself hooked on nicotine, you could buy alcohol, you could buy opiates. And but the people who seemed to use the most of those opiates were, at that time, were middle class or even upper middle class women, because their husbands were at the saloons anyway. They were busy at the saloons, and there was a lot of alcohol problems, that led to prohibition, even though prohibition of alcohol may not have been, the ideal solution at the time. Just like what happened with opiates. So a lot of these people who were buying opium and morphine, and they were self-treating themselves, and even doctors, if you had your horse and buggy and you were making a house call, you had some vials of morphine, because look, that's what worked. It made people happy, they were sick, you gave them a shot of morphine, okay. And the needle had been invented, only, in the later 1800s. So, as the decades went along, the needles were available. So a lot of people were in pain and were taking self-administering opiates, and many of them were getting badly addicted, and many sad stories. But, some of them were resistant to addiction, but just treating their pain with the opiates, and they were able to function. So then all of a sudden, the law said only physicians can write these drugs, So people flocked to physicians. They couldn't buy them at the pharmacy, but, quickly the physicians were somewhat overwhelmed by this. And then the physicians were getting blamed by the government, for promoting this. And so then the physicians were being punished if they were giving the opiates. So the availability of opiates for pain really started to diminish in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So we entered a period where maybe if you were wealthy, and you had the right connections, you could, and you had a severe pain, you could get some morphine, or maybe if you had surgery, you could get it for a few days. But opiates were hard to come by. So there was something called opiophobia, that there was a phobia against opiates. And when I went to medical school, it was starting to change where they were starting to say, maybe we're under-treating pain, and then there was something called the death and dying movement going on. And there was this brilliant doctor named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who wrote books. And then it started to be fashionable to think, well, if you're dying and you're in a lot of pain, maybe it's okay to have a few opiates, and you have a few days of comfort, you could communicate with your family. So that's when the hospice movement started. And in England, it particularly started that it was okay to treat people who were terminally ill, and particularly in cancer, but it was okay to treat them with opiates, even if they became dependent on the opiate, So things started to shift, and Purdue Pharma, which really crossed the line into misbehavior, with OxyContin, they introduced MS content, and in a way, at that time, they had white hats still, you know what I mean? Because they were providing long-acting morphine to people with cancer and intractable continuous pain. It was a lot better to give a drug that lasted 6 or 8 hours, or rather than 2 hours, or 4 hours, with oral morphine or injectable morphine. So things started to shift, and there was openness to treating pain. And then, again, society was like opening up and questioning things. And there was there was the environmental movement, there was the women's movement, there was a more progressive atmosphere. And so people started to say, well, look, if people are suffering, why not give them a few opiates, And so then came the drug reps and the hard sell, and the Duragesic patches and the fentanyl lollipops and the OxyContin. And again, the pendulum swung radically towards encouraging and almost making physicians prescribe these things, because if you didn't prescribe them and then somebody complained about you, you could actually face discipline also, So it was a crazy time, and nobody studied the history. Nobody was paying attention to buprenorphine, which was available. It was available at the same time OxyContin was available. It could have been instrumented, it could have been brought. But there's what drug comes to market and doesn't come to market, a lot of times depends on commercial incentives and different kind of cultural phenomena rather than true science, True science would say, let's let's use buprenorphine to cure this untreated pain epidemic, but instead OxyContin was used, and it triggered this very serious triple phase addiction. First there was the prescription opiates, then there was the heroin, when those were restricted, then there was the fentanyl, the triple phase addiction that we've been through societally. But I discovered something back in the early 2000s, which was that the buprenorphine in Europe was undergoing a renaissance because a particular company in Germany called Grunenthal had patented a buprenorphine transdermal for pain. And the sublingual was already available for addiction, but this was different. This was for pain. And they started to do studies and publish phenomenal results showing that transdermal buprenorphine, it turns out it's a higher dose in the European form than in the American form, was very effective. So I started to read this stuff because I would read everything about buprenorphine globally, and basically I discovered that that we were wrong about a lot of that the wrong ideas were being promulgated by the U.S. medical authorities. Some of them, at the NIH, for example, they said anyone on buprenorphine, if you're going to have surgery, take them off buprenorphine a week before, because the buprenorphine might interfere with the post-op opiates, And I learned that they weren't doing this in Europe at all, or in Australia, which was a few years ahead of us. So I questioned that authority, and I published case histories of people doing just fine having surgery on the buprenorphine. And so I became a kind of an early advocate for that. And although I was never an academic in terms of publish or perish, I wrote these small case series and got them published. And then now everyone cites our work. And, based on my work with buprenorphine and with the American Society of Addiction Medicine, I've been around long enough that they made me a, quote, distinguished fellow of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And then we did something else with the patch, with helping the induction of buprenorphine using the patch, because I saw what was going on in Europe. So gradually, we started to advocate more and more for buprenorphine. The doctors who were prescribing the OxyContin, they all, retreated, and they realized they couldn't do that. But instead of really finding out a new solution, they just said, we're not going to prescribe opiates anymore. So, and to this day, this persists. Like, I had a patient just some months ago who came to me, who was an old patient of mine who had gotten stabilized long ago for some other issues. And this patient had a very, very severe sciatica and literally could barely get from, the bed to the bathroom. And, and somehow the husband practically carried her into the orthopedic office, and they did some x-rays, and they said, well, we'll give you a Medrol dose pack, and schedule you for an MRI in 2 weeks and an epidural in 4 weeks, and then, somehow she called me. I said, "They didn't give you anything?" No, you know what I mean? So now doctors are, like, way overdoing it and not giving anything, to
Right.
their patients.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. The pendulum has swung for
yeah,
sure the other way.
yeah.
I want to bring us up to speed because you've had an extensive history and you've opened up a clinic. It's called Recovery Without Walls.
That's right.
So tell us about that and what inspired you to, I guess this is phase 4, in a way of what you created. So tell us about your clinic and, tell us about the
Yeah,
space
thank
and
you.
what you treat and what you do there.
Sure, thank you for asking, Sam. So, there's a new book out about drug rehab that, was just highlighted in the New York Times, and, there's such wonderful things about the drug recovery movement in the United States, and, and even the way the 12-step program, is integrated, and as it turns out, the 12-step program, as you've probably heard, was inspired by psychedelics, even though it's thought of as such an anti-drug program, you know what I mean? It was actually stimulated by Bill W., the founder of AA, being given belladonna alkaloids and scopolamine, in a detox in New York City in the 1930s and having a hallucinatory experience where he found God, and and that inspired him for 20 years, but when he heard that LSD was available in the 50s, he said, I should try it, and so that further inspired him as the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I've been in the addiction field. I've been intersecting with the 12-step program for many years, and I dive into the program myself with what's called the Al-Anon program, which is for people who, are like doctors and nurses who deal with alcoholics and addicts or family members. Um, so But when we started to use buprenorphine, none of the rehabs wanted to use it, even though it was already legal and recommended. They said, it's just substituting a drug for a drug, And so we decided to create our own treatment process without the walls of the rehab. So we called it Recovery Without Walls. But we also wanted to say we wanted a program that did not have the ideological walls or the conceptual walls. And so that's how Recovery Without Walls got started. So we do addiction medicine, we do pain medicine, we do integrative psychiatry with the help of our nurse practitioner, Ina Zelikman, who is a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner who's become one of the leaders in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in our community. So that intersects with the ketamine startup, paradigm that that you've been exploring.
Yeah. And ketamine is an interesting drug because, it's a paradox in a way because there is ketamine use disorder, and at the same time some studies are showing that ketamine can help patients get off of other, opioid use disorder or alcohol use disorder. Like there's a study, I think it's happening in University College of London, where they're using ketamine to help patients with alcohol use disorder. So, what are your thoughts on this paradoxical nature of ketamine?
I think the way we have found it the most useful is we do detox. Mostly we do detox without ketamine, although there's some very innovative emergency physicians, um, that that are using ketamine for buprenorphine induction, to make that induction process. Andrew Herring at Highland Hospital, who we actually we were mentors to him when we were over there at the chronic pain clinic. But the way we have found it most useful is if somebody's coming in with alcohol dependency or opiate dependency or methamphetamine or whatever, cocaine, we kind of get them on their feet during the first few weeks, see if we could stabilize them and get them integrated with their family and get them on a healthy diet and lifestyle and maybe going to some meetings and having peer support and having psychotherapy. And then we might say, you know, if we strategically use some sessions of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, maybe we can front load, or we can accelerate some insights and recovery. So that's how we've been using it primarily. And I would say we've had some amazing results. Of course, every case doesn't work in everybody. Some people don't react as well to it. But a lot of it is also dosing, how you start the dosing, if you start low and explore what a person's capacity is, and then also how it's done, the set and setting, of course, the music and the ambiance is all very important. And then what do they go home to? After the ketamine session, it's important that they don't just go home to an abusive, environment, So we have to orchestrate everything ideally to optimize the results. But at the same time, we have treated some pretty nasty cases of ketamine use disorder. And we have found, because ketamine does dock onto the opiate receptor as part of its its neurochemistry, that for some cases, particularly when there might be some pain issues, that buprenorphine can be a tool to get someone off of that merry-go-round of ketamine abuse. And as you know, there's the bladder toxicity. There's even the biliary system can be affected. And one problem with the ketamine use disorder patients is, because they've had some very positive spiritual experiences with ketamine, sometimes they're chasing that spiritual, insight that they got originally, and they keep upping the ante, to find that spiritual thing. Now, someone with cocaine or opiate might say, I remember that euphoria, and I want to regain it, but they don't necessarily think it's a philosophical insight. But people with ketamine really believe, and they could have had a profound insight early in their ketamine use career, but now we have to sort of help remind them that you could find that spiritual insight without the ketamine,
Yeah. So let's get into the nuts and bolts, because one of the things that we focus on is like, how does a clinician actually start up a clinic? And, you've built a successful private practice. So what advice would you give to a physician or clinician who's about to embark on starting up their own practice? What have you learned, and what, insights have you gained?
One thing, we need to grow a little bit, and because I'm going to retire one of these days, so you can come over to our practice and hang out, and maybe we'll work together. So I wanted to put out there to younger physicians, number one. Number two is, I would say, a foundation in what's called integrative medicine, the kind of work that Andrew Weil has done over the years at the University of Arizona. And Andrew Weil was a leader in psychedelics and still is, and then he became the leader in integrative medicine. So there is a connection between those two. I would say that to really understand that whole conundrum of what is the mind-body, uh, concept, and that people will say, it's not in my head, and yet the head and the body are always working together. So I would say um, taking coursework like at places like Esalen, that are teaching mindfulness and is very important for a physician. And then really uh, learning, read that molecular neurobiology book in great detail. You know what I mean? Because if you know what's going on, sometimes you could use our current tools in innovative ways, Like, for example, um, we might use the drug lamotrigine or Lamictal, which is an anticonvulsant drug, but we might use it for depression because it also has activity there that we could learn about. So I would say learn things at multiple levels, and when you can, start wherever you can start. But it has been very liberating to be able to work outside of the third-party payer system. So I started to do that before the word concierge was even used in medicine, and I'm not completely comfortable with that word because it implies, an upper class that can afford that and a lower class that cannot. But work outside as much as you can, the third-party payer system, because then you don't have to put all your energy into showing the insurance company that you're doing the right thing. And the way I try to balance it is I give away, a certain amount of medical care, like the old Dr. Welby or whatever did on his television program. And, sometimes you take, a bushel of corn instead of money, if that's what someone has to give you for being a doctor for them. So I would say some of the old-fashioned good parts of being a doctor, try to bring those in. And really try to, when you get a patient, these days you get a patient, and they have a chronic problem. They've seen 10 different doctors already. They've been in 4 different hospitals. Actually take the time to read those old records, find out what really happened. Also, they're not going to get better without their family being involved or whatever exists. Even when the family is estranged. Even if they tell you, oh, I never talked to my brother. you know, but yet, if that's the only real connection in that person's life, maybe that brother needs to be brought in. Um, and so we try to bring in the family, because I've learned that if I'm treating that patient and there's this estranged family that doesn't want to be involved, or the patient doesn't want them involved, and yet they overdose, one night, and then the next morning the whole family's in my office flying in. What happened? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I really try to bring the families in, and the friends, and I create what's called an inner circle of openness, in people's lives, because people heal within a family and within a system.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. It reminds me of where I did my training, University of Rochester, and they really emphasize the biopsychosocial
that's right.
approach to medicine.
Hmm.
And you're really highlighting that social component, whether that's family, friends, that inner circle.
Hmm.
It does play a crucial role in healing
Yeah,
for our patients. They're not an isolated unit; they're actually within a whole system,
yeah, yeah,
and we need to heal that as well.
yeah.
A few more questions for you as we wrap up, and I do want to honor your time. So let's see. What advice would your 100-year-old self give you today?
Well, I got another quarter century to go. I would say to continue to emphasize self-care. As you get older, you do have to devote more time to self-care, and And there's a little paradox because as you get older, you know more stuff and you want to help more people, but yeah, you have to take care of yourself. So um, I'm trying to give myself that message. I think my 100-year-old self would advocate for that. But I would keep doing what I'm doing. As you know, I've become active again in this prevention of nuclear war because,
Yeah.
uh, we have to. Um, this concept of person and planet, person, planet. We always have to think in those terms. Um, and the guy who invented the term counterculture, Theodore Roszak, wrote a book called Person, Planet. So I would like to create a momentum within the health community and the medical community to, even as we deal with problems in our office, that we keep an eye to the climate crisis, that we keep an eye to the prevention of nuclear war. And um, I think it can transcend the whole partisan. We have a pendulum also that swings, from one party to another, one ideology to another. But I think if we, as doctors, if we keep in mind that such a fundamental thing is actually nonpartisan, and it's not right wing or left wing, it's humanity. And you'll find voices on all ends of the spectrum that are actually worried and concerned. And so I would advocate more for that. And medical leadership. I think doctors are important. Once upon a time, there was a tribe, there was the chieftain, but then there was the shaman. And the tribe couldn't survive without the shaman, even though the chieftain maybe had the power, you know what I mean, and had the spears. But the shaman kept the tribe together. And we as doctors need to assume a leadership role as the shamans of our culture. That's a message I would give.
Thank you so much for that. That is so true. I kind of think about doctors and nurses and clinicians. We're kind of like the white blood cells of our society and of our earth. And we're the immune system. So we're not the brain necessarily of the global planet per se, but I think we do play an important, crucial role in, the bigger picture of Earth.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a beautiful way to wrap up. Now, if people want to find out more about you, follow your work, refer patients, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I would say this name, recoverywithoutwalls.com, or just search for Recovery Without Walls. There is a small little place in Cape Cod that uses that name, but we're in Mill Valley, California. And yeah, we're easy to find. And we have a wonderful staff and if we can't take care of your problem, we don't just hang up the phone and say, we can't take care of you. We always try to find help for you, refer you to the right sources. So feel free, recoverywithoutwalls.com, to reach out to us if for addiction, for pain, for mental health, just to get a second opinion on anything you want.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kornfeld. It's been an honor talking with you. You mentioned a lot of names during this interview, and what was coming up for me is you are also one of the very important leaders and pioneers in this space. You've played a catalytic role in some of the things that we see today. So I'm grateful for your leadership. Grateful to have you as a friend and a mentor in a way. So I really appreciate your time and just everything you've shared with us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've been a wonderful interviewer, and I think your show, your podcast is just a wonderful project. So thank you for that, Sam.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ketamine Startup Podcast. If you found this episode valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other entrepreneurial medical professionals like you discover the show and grow this community. For show notes, resources, and selected links mentioned in today's episode, visit our website at www.ketaminestartup.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.